Okay, welcome back. This is Task B of the Fundamentals of Instruction. There is a ton of information here, and I'm going to try really hard to get this under 30 minutes. So hopefully parts that I kind of gloss over aren't too important. If you have questions, again, refer back to the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, published by the FAA. First concept, we're going to talk about learning theory. There are two theories on how people learn. One is behaviorism. Behaviorism says that carrot or the stick is what motivates people to learn. They either are rewarded or punished. Second is cognitive theory. Cognitive theory is a higher approach, I guess you would say. It's focused on what people are thinking, the process of how they think and learn. More about the perceiving, problem solving, decision making, and awareness than it is the stimulus response. So, either way, how do we learn? Talked a little bit about it last lesson in Task A, but our learning comes through experiences. And how do we gain experiences? Through perceptions. Now, we perceive things with our five senses, right? We either see it, smell it, touch it, taste it, or hear it. And those perceptions are what make up our experiences. Now, some people are going to have better senses than others. Somebody might have a disability. So factors that will hinder, I guess you would say, or affect, what I'm looking for, factors that affect our ability to perceive is our own physical bodies. Somebody might have a poor eyesight. That's going to affect their ability to perceive. Somebody might have nerve damage, right? So they can't touch things very well. All factors that affect our ability to perceive. Second one is our goals or what we value. Okay, what do we hold important or what do we want to accomplish? And if we're particularly looking for those things, those goals, we're going to be more open to perceiving them. Maybe a student's goal is work on landings. They really want to get good at landings. So anything they hear that is going to help them become better at landing, they're going to be primed to hear that and be aware. Next one, your own self-concept. Remember we talked about self-esteem in the Task A. Self-concept is simply stating that people who are more confident will be more open to learning than a person who has a negative attitude about themselves or low self-esteem. So self-concept is really important. Another factor that affects our ability to perceive is time and opportunity. If you're not taking, oops, totally misspelled that. Opportunity. There we go. If you're not placing yourself in positions to learn new things, you're never going to learn them, right? If you want to learn about airport operations, then you should probably hang out at an airport and not a soccer field. Just plain and simple. You have to take the time and make the opportunities. And finally is the element of threats. A student who is scared will not learn, plain and simple. If they perceive a threat to their own safety, it's going to stymie their learning. So our insights is taking all of this, gathering all of our perceptions into a meaningful picture. And with all these different perceptions formulating insights, our insights become experiences and we learn from our experiences. So let us shift gears a little bit. We'll shift pen colors. And now let us talk about how we acquire knowledge. because this is really, really important. If we don't know how a student or ourselves acquires knowledge, then we can't really teach now, can we? Real estate here. Acquiring knowledge. There is an aspect where we have to memorize things. Rote memorization, plain and simple, right? Um, this is the first method, I guess you would say, that most students begin with. They memorize the downwind checklist, and they can tell you uh, what to do on downwind, but they probably maybe don't understand it necessarily at first. So after we've memorized something, understanding. Knowing why something works that way as well as how it works. This is understanding. We've graduated from just spewing out facts and figures on memorization, and we understand, okay, now I know why I need to be at 80 knots on the downwind or whatever your number is, instead of just saying 80 knots downwind. Couldn't tell you why, but that's what we do. The next one is concept learning. So you see we're progressing here in how people learn and their level of understanding. Concept learning is the ability to make correlations from similar circumstances. So, for example, if we understand that the altimeter works on pressure, then we can make the jump or we can make the transition to the airspeed indicator and understanding that it works on pressure as well. So if we understand that we want 80 knots on downwind, because slower than that, we run the risk of stalling maybe, then once we get around to practicing power on stalls or power off stalls or anything like that, we understand that our airspeed is really important. Okay. The next concept we're going to talk about is laws of learning. The laws of learning were written by a man named E.L. Thorndike. I'll put his name up here. These are important because they will help us to better prepare our students to learn. Laws of learning. Scroll down. E.L. Thorndike came up with, let's see, 6 different laws of learning. First one is readiness. If the student is not ready to learn, they will not learn. Their basic needs must be met, just like we saw with Maslow, and we have to create teachable moments. Or, better put, we have to take advantage of teachable moments. So let's say, worst case scenario, short final, airspeed's too slow, they stall the airplane and they crash at the end of the runway. Well, that's a bad day, I will agree, but it is an example of a teachable moment, right? That a catastrophic event just happened and we take advantage of it to explain this is why we don't get slow on short final. This is why we keep the nose down, okay? The next one is effect. Learning is strengthened when followed by success, and learning is weakened when it's followed by failure. Okay, pretty self-explanatory, cause and effect. So, strengthened, I'll put an arrow for success. Learning is weakened with failure. There will be failures. Eventually, they'll be turned into successes. Next, exercise. Repetition is key, right? The more we do something, the more strengthened it becomes, the more ingrained it becomes. And it weakens the less we do something. That's why we like to see students having regular lessons versus once a week or once every 2 weeks. You have to exercise what you have learned. Primacy. This one is huge, the law of primacy. Basically stated, whatever you learn first, it sticks with you. For me, what does that look like? LC gumps. Landing light, carb heat, gauges and selector valve, undercarriage, got a wheel, mixtures which, pitch, prop is set, seat belts and switches are on. Okay, a lot of people will just use gumps. Other people use different things, but I always say the same thing: undercarriage, down and locked, mixtures, full, rich, props, all that stuff. It's just the first thing that I learned, and it has stuck with me ever since. The law of primacy is really important. If your students see you struggling demonstrating something, they're going to think, wow, this must be really hard, and I must not be able to do it right off the bat. Next law of learning, intensity. Real world dramatic learning is more exciting and more intense than a boring experience, right? It makes a lasting impression. If what you're teaching and what they're perceiving is just boring and bland, they're not going to remember it, nor are they going to really care about it probably. Finally, the law of recency. That which is learned most recently is best remembered. So you teach them task A, B, C, D, E, right? And you leave the lesson at that. When you come back and pick up, they're probably going to remember E the best. So the law of recency. Anyways, E.L. Thorndike, laws of learning, great information here and great things to keep in mind when you're teaching somebody. All right, let's move on. Next, we are going to talk about domains of learning. This is it's really down in the weeds, and I'm going to, I don't say gloss over it, but we could spend hours talking about domains of learning here. Bloom's taxonomy of cognitive domain is an incredibly complex bit of information. However, he breaks it down into, just going to list them here: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, oops, S, synthesis, and this, and evaluation. First, we gain knowledge, we comprehend it, we apply it, we analyze it, we synthesize it into parts. Instead of being chunked separately, we put it all together, and then we evaluate. How did it work out? Okay. Those are domains of learning, according to Bloom. I encourage you, if you're so inclined, to study it in depth. Once you're done, you can apply for a PhD. The basic levels of learning occur at 4 levels. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Rote, this is your memorization, right? Memorizing lists, mnemonics, things like that. Next, we understand the concepts. We apply them, and then we correlate them. Okay, so let's think see if we can think of an example here. Something that starts out as rote memorization. Well, we talked about airspeeds before. And let's say we memorize that 60 knots is our short final approach speed. We just memorize that. Okay? We don't really understand why until we start to learn more about aerodynamics. We apply that in our landings, and then we correlate it to other things, such as power on or power off stalls. So this is typically how people learn and progress through the learning. Next, let us talk about the affective domain. And particularly emotions. We have 5 levels. 5 levels for the affective domain. 1 is awareness. The student has a willingness to listen and learn. They're aware of what is going on. Second, response. They're either compliant or non-compliant. They either accept or reject what you have to say. Third, value. Does the concept that I just learned have value to me? Is it worth anything? Not financially, but does it apply? Is it important? Am I going to put this in my toolbox of things to learn and remember? Next, organization. They organize that which is important to them in a hierarchy of order, right? So the important things will be moved to the front, less important will be moved towards the bottom or the back. Finally, integration. They make changes to their behavior, to their life, to their flying technique or methods. These are all pretty difficult to judge. They are internal to a student. It's difficult to measure these 5 affective domains because they are emotions, and our emotions aren't always entirely visible. So keep that in mind, that your student is going to go through this process of valuing and organizing, integrating what you've taught. The next learning domain is the psychomotor. So we've had the cognitive domain, that was Bloom's taxonomy. We've had the affective domain, or the emotional, which we just saw. And finally, we have the psychomotor. As you can probably guess, this is skills-based, right? And an ability to perform. We teach them something, and they either perform it or they don't, or they're able to do it through practice. So in order to break down the psychomotor domain further, student first observes, right? Then they imitate what they saw. Then they practice it, and then it becomes a habit. In this order: observing the instructor, imitating the instructor, practice through repetition, and then, and only then, it becomes a habit. Okay? So there's our 3 domains of learning: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. Those are there are many other concepts, but these are sufficient for our purposes. All right, switching gears and switching colors. Let's talk about characteristics of learning. Again, a lot of information here. We're going to gloss over much of it and refer you to the book for further detailed reading. Learning has a purpose. It's a result of experience and is an active process. Okay, we know that. Every student has their own style of learning. We know that also. Interestingly, psychologists have identified 71 different learning styles. So you didn't mishear me. 71. There's no way we can talk about all of them. But it's important to realize that 71 different learning styles that we are going to have to overcome as instructors or uh, integrate into. So let's talk about right versus left brain people, because that's kind of a um, important topic. Right brain, these people respond well to demonstration. They need to see it. Okay, they need to be demonstrated things. They learn general concepts and then detailed. So you might call this like an upside down pyramid. That's a good looking pyramid. They start general, right? All this information comes in, and then as it gets down here towards the funnel, it becomes more specific. They like open-ended questions, so things that cause them to think and formulate an answer. Left brain, they prefer verbal instructions. They can be told how to do it verbally and have success, step by step. So do this, and then this, and then this. Orderly and repetitive, planned and structured, and they take more of a bottom up approach. So if we invert our pyramid here, they like to go from specific and then more general, bigger concepts at the end. All right, we're going to drive on here and talk about visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learners. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic learners. Obviously, visual is seeing. Auditory, hearing. Kinesthetic, touch or viewing. People use all three, but usually they have one dominant over the others. So somebody who is maybe right-brained is going to, as we said, respond better to demonstration. They might be more kinesthetic learners versus the left-brain person who thrives on the step-by-step format. They might be visual. You just have to see it, and they're good. So that that wraps up the left brain, right brain kind of conversation, and just be aware of maybe your student knows if they're a left or a right brain learner, maybe they don't, so keep that in mind. Next section is on acquiring skills. Again, we've kind of already talked about this, and some of this is repetitive, but let's just jot it down here anyways. How does somebody acquire skills? It's very similar to how they acquire knowledge, right? There's a cognitive stage where they memorize and understand the concept. Associative stage, this is where they put motor skills together with their cognitive skills. Automatic response, we can also call this, response. Something clicks in their brain or in their ability, and it just happens. It no longer requires extreme attention. Okay. Habit, we're starting to form a habit here. Next, we develop those skills. The law of practice, performance increases to the power the number of times a skill is practiced. Straight from the book, but it's not too difficult, right? The more you do something, the better you get. And keep in mind there are going to be learning plateaus, points where progress is not as quick as it was before. So Let's take landing an airplane. It's an easy example. First, we have the cognitive. We understand what we need to do, right? And then we put our psychomotor skills to work. We associate those psychomotor skills with the cognitive skills. Next, we practice it until something clicks and it begins to happen. Our landings start to get really good. Then we go out and practice it a whole bunch. Every time that you fly, you practice it. And that's developing your skill and your expertise. Keeping in mind that we have learning plateaus. And if we were to graph learning, it might look something like this, where we have skill over here and time over here. We can gain a whole bunch of skill early in a short amount of time because why? Well, because we really suck down here. And up here is really, really good. This is expert level. So we might go something like this, where our skill increases rapidly over time, but then we start to have smaller and smaller gains, if we have any gains at all. So keep that in mind and let your students know that that very well may and will happen. So our students are practicing, we're practicing. Let's talk about types of practice. First, we have deliberate. There are no distractions. It's perfect, sterile environment. We're focused on improving one's skill. Okay. Now we have blocked practice. This is performing the skill over and over. This increases our short-term repeatability, but it's emphasis on short-term. So we just do something over and over and over. Let's just call it an affinity symbol, right? Doing the same thing. And now we have random. Random is simply mixing it up. Students begin to see patterns developing in their skills and the concepts they're learning, as well as a commonality of technique. Okay, maybe as you transition and fly different airplanes, you see why it's important. I don't know, fly with your left hand and use your right hand for controls or for the throttle. This quadrant. Um, so we start to identify different techniques through different experiences, different concepts. Another good example of that is we've learned the basics of stalling, so let's do power on and power off stalls. A spin is obviously a kind of stall, so as we mix up the different kinds of stalls, the students' skills progress exponentially. Okay? Types of practice. Now, good practice is going to be based on SBT, scenario-based training. The FAA loves scenario-based training, and it's a good concept in my opinion as well. Good scenarios will have clear objectives. They'll be tailored to the needs of the student, and they will also be relevant to the environment they're flying in. So as I learned to fly in Kansas, I was not really all that interested in mountain flying techniques. It didn't apply to me. Conversely, somebody who flies exclusively in the mountains is going to be more concerned with airflow, maybe downdrafts, reading the wind and the weather, things like that. So scenario-based training is a must-do. If your student is learning to fly for a particular reason, business, then let's make scenarios based on their business. And we can incorporate aeronautical decision making into those scenarios so we get double the bang for our buck. Next thing, let's talk about our errors. All right, there's several different kinds of errors. and the FAA says it's important for us to know them. So we will talk about them. First one is a slip. Your student plans to do one thing, which is the right thing, but they accidentally does something different. Example is they planned to land on runway 21, but instead they landed on 3. It was not anything more than a slip of error. Next, we have a mistake. This is when somebody plans on the wrong thing from the very beginning. Okay, so let's go over here to our runway. This, of course, is runway 27, and this is runway 9, because we all know that north is always up, regardless. So a slip, student says, hey, I'm going to land on runway 9, and then they come in and do one of these numbers. Okay. Whoops. Mistake with the wind. Let's see, I got to get the mistake would be with the wind coming from this direction. Obviously, runway 9 would be the favored runway. They say from the very beginning, okay, I'm going to enter a left downwind for 27 and land on runway 27. Okay, that's a mistake because they misinterpreted the data and they planned the wrong thing from the very beginning. So how do we reduce these? How do we get rid of slips and mistakes? Well, it boils down to just practice and learning, taking time with the student to talk about them, using reminders. You know, we have our windsock here. Our windsock is big and then it goes small like this, right? Here's our windsock. So maybe we can explain to our student, hey, we always want to fly in the little end and out the big end of the windsock. So that will help them to reduce that error in the future. Routines are good. You know, they get into a routine of doing things and raising their awareness, being aware at all times what they're doing. Okay. So we have now successfully talked about the 2 kinds of errors that the FAA wants us to cover. Let's shift gears, talk about memory and forgetting. If I didn't write it down here, I would forget it. So, several different types of concepts when we're talking about memory. First is our short-term memory. This is usually under 30 seconds. Okay, we're told a list of instructions to do, and we do it. Perfect example is an IFR clearance. All right, we write it down and we remember most of it. We regurgitate it back to them. They tell us readback is correct, and it's purged from our short-term memory. Next, you can probably guess our long-term memory. This can easily last for a lifetime. Perfect example, my LC Gumps. I will never forget LC Gumps. I haven't heard many other people use the LC part, but my instructor stressed that, and so that is committed to my long-term memory for life. Forgetting, the 2 memory concepts. So forget. What happens when we forget about it? We have a retrieval failure. This is where it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't remember it for the life of you. There's your tongue. Right? There it is. Retrieval. Just can't seem to recall that person's name or what a part was called or whatever. Next, fading. Information is slowly lost over time, that we don't use. So here we have a lot of information. As time goes on, it just kind of tapers off. That's fading. Interference, INT. Learning something similar causes our memory to fade. We confuse the two concepts. That is interference. If we had concepts that were entirely different, then there would be no problem remembering them. But when two concepts are similar, they kind of do something like this. And we're confused as to which was which from the very beginning. And then finally, there's the active act of repressing memories. So this is where you're trying to forget something, usually a bad memory, but there is repression or suppression where a student simply tries to forget. Might be a bad instructor or a bad experience or whatever. So we've addressed all these concepts. Let's wrap it all up together here. How do we retain this information? Because that's the goal, right? We want to retain it and we want to transfer it into our long-term memory bank. We want to apply it into our daily life and our career as a pilot. First thing, praise. Everybody responds well. Positive reinforcement. Next, we want to associate it with something we already know. So from the known, from the known, bunch of these knowns, we delve into the unknown, and eventually this is crossed out and becomes a known. So we're leapfrogging from one known to the next till we get to the unknown, which becomes familiar at that point. We talked about self-esteem, and I'm going to call this self-esteem / a good attitude. That's both for our students and us as instructors. We have to maintain a good attitude, which develops positive self-esteem, which develops good retention. We want to incorporate as many of the 5 senses as possible. We don't know if a smell is going to trigger something in somebody, and then remember, oh yeah, check the gas. The more senses that we incorporate, the more perceptions we create. More perceptions turn into insights, which turn into experiences, which turns into learning. Okay? Repetition. What did I say? Repetition. Repetition is the key. We have to do something over and over for it to become a habit. And finally, mnemonics work great. We've all had the pleasure of memorizing tons of mnemonics. It might be the flaming tomatoes, right? We all learned that one. I showed you my L.C. Gumps, the 3 T's. Aviation is full of mnemonics. After we have retained this learning, we want to transfer it. We want to apply that which has been learned to other aspects of our aviation learning. For example, once we learn steep turns, right, here's our wings. Once we have learned steep turns, well, now we can learn chandelles, where we're doing steep turns back to back. Okay? We can learn other things after we have learned the basics. So we want to apply it and associate them together. That, my friends, brings us to the end of Task B. Once again, FAA-H-8083-9A is your friend. That was Fundamentals of Instructing, Task B. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.